Calling all adventure fans. Calling all Dick Tracy fans. Stand by. Dick Tracy is on the air.
There was a time when almost every radio listener in America would have recognized that urgent call. The comic strip character Dick Tracy was on the job fighting crime, just as today's audiences might respond to Spider-Man or some other character in the Marvel Universe.
I surrender.
Who are you working for?
I have nothing to say.
But not everyone would have known about the man who brought Tracy into their homes, along with hundreds of other characters. His name was Himan Brown, and he is the hero of this series, Audio Maverick.
Come in.
It's a podcast about one of radio's most important pioneers, the world he came from, the world he helped create, and his legacy in sound. In many ways, he was both ahead of his time, an intuitive innovator in the form of audio drama, and very much of it, having to balance the needs of networks and advertisers against his desire to push creative limits. I'm Margot Avery. Stay tuned.
The door's open.
Welcome.
You're broadcasting over WAAM, and this comes to you direct from the Edison Studios.
Radio is a real-time medium, and before the internet and apps and downloads, listeners could tune in only to the bandwidths assigned to their local stations by the Federal Communications Commission.
KYWFM, Cleveland, Ohio.
This is WJBK Radio.
WOKY, Milwaukee News.
WIBG. And once listeners found their place, dozens of programs awaited them, created by the large networks that owned the stations. Screwball or serious, fantastical or topical, the shows were designed to get audiences hooked so that they'd tune in day after day. Himan Brown is one of the reasons they did.
So I was running Dick Tracy, I was running the Gumps, I was running Blue Coal, I was doing the soap operas for Mrs. Hummett, and I was the proverbial one-armed paper hanger, but having the time of my life.
That's Brown in 1991 speaking to broadcaster Chuck Shaden at the Museum for Radio in Chicago. Himan Brown has a classic American origin story. His parents emigrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, and Brown invented himself as a creator and entrepreneur in response to an era of great change and innovation, and specifically in response to a technology that would redefine entertainment in the home, just as movies were redefining the public experience. The so-called golden age of radio between the late 1920s and the late 1940s generated thousands of programs. There were variety shows, domestic comedies, and hundreds of dramas in every genre from crime to classics. The products of this new industry reflected an evolving America, and both behind the scenes and on the air, a new generation of creative artists. My mother, Margot Stevenson, was one of the stars of the era.
Hello?
Hello, Margot?
Oh, Lamont, where are you?
Well, I'm leaving for your place in a few minutes. How's everything going out there in the country?
Oh, fine, thanks.
Well, that's good.
That's Mom playing the lovely Margot Lane from the Golden Age classic, The Shadow.
All by yourself?
Oh, Lamont, I'm not alone. Katie, the new maid, is here.
But...
Through my mother, broadcast radio is part of my legacy, and I also inherited her love of theater and became an actor myself. So I was delighted to be asked to host a show celebrating Himan Brown.
But do be careful, please. Bye.
Goodbye. Silly.
Today, we are used to the invasive aspects of media. As media consumers, we know that we're part of a marketplace, one that finds us where we live, whether it's our favorite podcast, our search engine, or YouTube.
When was the last time you were truly focused?
The Capital One Smart
Thing that's different about a Verbo vacation
Introducing
home?
My Home from Verizon.
But this is not new. Golden Age entertainment radio was the model for today's product-driven, consumer-focused media. And we'll hear more about that in episode 4. But first, imagine a world before television, before the internet, before apps and bots. A world in which a story had to reach across a gulf of possibility, had to imagine who you were and what you might like, not based on your zip code or your income or your ethnicity or the last thing you purchased. And it asked you to imagine something in return.
It is later than you think.
That's the creepy opening of the show called, evocatively, Lights Out.
Lights Out brings you stories of the supernatural and the supernormal.
Its writers and creators understood intuitively how radio could get inside your head. But in order for radio programming to evoke terror or glee, radios themselves had to become part of the domestic scene. They were eye-catching as well as ear-catching, made of the glossy plastic Bakelite in a surprising range of colors from dignified mahogany to lurid yellows and greens. They were sometimes nearly a foot high and shaped like a small cathedral. They had shiny knobs and fancy grillwork and sat in your house like a shrine.
The sale of huge console radios went soaring, and those console radios were like a piece of furniture. Sometimes they were very nice wooden cabinets, in fact, truly pieces of furniture that happened to deliver entertainment.
That's broadcast historian Leonard Moulton.
Radio came on the scene in the 1920s in somewhat the same way that the internet arrived in our world, in our society. It was something that very few people knew anything about at first, and then it spread like wildfire.
As a child, Himan Brown encountered an even simpler form of the radio, which operated with crystals, not the tubes that later became standard. Here's Himan Brown.
And just about that time came a thing called radio, crystal sets. We wrapped copper wire around milk containers and had a little condenser, cat's whisker kind of thing with earphones.
Before radio programs became all the rage with characters who felt like members of your family, radio itself, as a medium of transmission, had to be discovered, explained, and tested. The early pioneers were both craftsmen and poets, coaxing song lines of sound out of the air with Rube Goldbergian inventions. The history of invention and change is like an aurora borealis, cloudy, vast, and numinous with pinpricks of light. Invention is directly or indirectly always a collaborative effort, a continuum across time and space, linking brilliant minds, all pulled toward the next leg of the journey. Even when these radio pioneers were competing, and patents, products, and businesses were generated to support these innovators and the marketplace, they were moving the form towards something that could be shaped and understood by everyone. So, like most inventions, the actual beginning of radio is somewhat contested. Several pioneers are key figures in the journey, and all are often referred to, or referred to themselves, as fathers of particular facets of radio technology. Technology was undeniably still patriarchal in those days, but formidable broadcast mothers were on the horizon. Two men overlap as the authors of the first radio wave transmission, Serbian Nikola Tesla, yes, the one the sleek car is named for, and Italian Guglielmo Marconi. Nikola Tesla was a child prodigy with a passion for electrical engineering who contributed a wide range of earlier technologies to society. But for the purposes of our story, most important is a demonstration he gave in 1893 of electromagnetic energy without wires. The occasion was the National Electric Light Association meeting in St. Louis, and this was the perfect crowd to wow. The NELA was a trade association that included operators, electrical engineers, scientists, educational institutions, and curious laymen. In June of the following year, Tesla moved to New York. He was given to showy public displays demonstrating wireless remote control, which drives you crazy when your kids play with tanks, tractors, and Wall-E, at the 1898 Electrical Exhibition in Madison Square Garden. He also conducted radio transmission experiments from the roof of one of his home bases, the former Gerlach Hotel in Chelsea. In his honor, the space at 49 West 27th Street is now known as the Radio Wave Building. It's so close to Himan Brown's own eventual studio, now Chelsea Television Studios, that it's easy to imagine him walking by it, one legend passing before another one. We took a walk there ourselves a few months ago. Like so much in New York City, the building was imprisoned in scaffolding, but its graceful scrollwork was still evident on its imposing gray facade. The building was completed in 1920. To the right of the doors, several feet above eye level, is a plaque in Tesla's honor. We read it.
In this house lived Nikola Tesla, 1856 to 1943, the great Yugoslav-American scientist-inventor whose discoveries in the field of alternating electric current contributed to the advancement of the United States and the rest of the world.
The Radio Wave building is given over to various small businesses, including some recording studios, and at street level, a trendy bar. But the past seems to linger under the surface of the clutter, and it's not hard to imagine the boundless possibilities of electrical power.
Electric power is everywhere present in unlimited quantities. It can drive the world's machinery without the need of coal, oil, gas, or any other fuel.
And among the machines it eventually powered was the radio. The other father of radio was Guglielmo Marconi, a physicist and inventor born in Bologna. His early experiments in radio wave transmission proved that it was possible to send radio signals to some designated point, starting with small demonstrations like making a bell ring in his mother's home and capturing radio waves generated by lightning, to long-distance transmitter and receiver systems that made him one of the first international broadcast entrepreneurs. Marconi actually made use of technologies patented by Tesla, and they were heading in the same direction. A fire in Tesla's studio halted his progress, and Marconi went on to take the honors in most sources as the author of the first transatlantic wireless transmission on December 12, 1901. The demonstration was from Signal Hill in Newfoundland, where, with the use of a kite antenna, Marconi claimed to have heard a signal more than 2,000 miles from the transmitter. The claim is contested. According to late Canadian radio producer Chris Brooks,
the important thing about the birth of radio on Signal Hill is that it didn't really happen. A physicist at Canada's National Research Council has proved it was scientifically impossible.
But Brooks generously grants that conviction and excitement might have led the scientist to imagine what he heard.
A little Italian man listening for 3 solid days with earphones clapped to his skull. A man giving radio his full attention. Does it give him the information? No. It engages his imagination so powerfully that he imagines the information.
Marconi's magic moment has been extensively discussed in scientific journals. The consensus is that some sort of ricochet effect actually connected the two signals. But in the end, it didn't matter. Marconi's demonstration established him as both a technical thought leader and an entrepreneur, because in the heady period of the late 19th and early 20th century, inventions were both mind-bending discoveries and the bedrock of commerce and prosperity. Marconi's firm, the American Marconi Company, became the leading telecommunications supplier in the U.S. And when, on April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic hit the iceberg, operators using Marconi's telegraphic equipment sent the first ever SOS signal.
CQD, SOS, 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 CQD, CQD. This is Titanic.
So at this point, radio was primarily just signals, arcs of sound in experiments about transmission and the clicking dots and dashes of telegraphy. But in 1900, Canadian scientist Reginald Fessenden achieved the first transmission of speech by radio, and in 1906 he generated what was called the first two-way radio-telegraphic communication across the Atlantic Ocean. Basically, this means using the radio as if it were a telephone. Here is his famous Christmas Eve broadcast.
Good evening. This is Professor Reginald A. Fessenden, speaking to you from Brant Rock, Massachusetts, at the tower of the National Electric Signaling Company.
Radio was still mysterious, miraculous, but with Fessenden's achievement, it was also coming closer to being something that could be shared with the public, a consumable rather than an invention. 3 very different men from different backgrounds shaped the second wave of radio's evolution. Lee DeForest was the son of a rural congregational minister. Edwin Howard Armstrong was an East Coast Ivy Leaguer, and David Sarnoff had a background similar to Himan Brown's. He was a first-generation Russian immigrant. DeForest, born in 1873, invented the Audion, a vacuum tube device that could take a weak electrical signal and amplify it into a stronger one. It was first used to support phone service, helping AT&T become a communications giant. DeForest's claim to original work was often disputed. DeForest's professional nemesis, Edwin Howard Armstrong, was born in 1890. Armstrong was passionate, flamboyant, and intuitive. He could examine another scientist's train of thought and pull it out to the next level, one of the traits that embroiled him in lawsuits for much of his life. Although not a scientist, David Sarnoff's role was also crucial. Born in 1891, he lived until 1971, the year the first personal computer was introduced. Inventors contribute and expand the possibilities of time, space, and materials, but it is sometimes businessmen who take the ideas to market. RCA evolved from the American Marconi Company, where Davy Sarnoff started as a telegrapher, parlaying his role in the Titanic disaster into other opportunities, and rose to head the company. He understood that radio was a commodity and one that he wanted to trade in. Howard Armstrong's patents were his building blocks. These men were the key protagonists in Tom Lewis's 1991 book, Empire of the Air, The Men Who Made Radio. A radio adaptation by Otherworld Media gives us a sense of their characters. Here's DeForest, played by John Randolph. He's portrayed as part scientist, part huckster.
Truly, wireless telegraphy is the greatest of wonders and the choicest of all callings. I urge all of you here in the DeForest building to enjoy and learn from the exhibitions we have prepared for you.
Edwin Howard Armstrong had already demonstrated that he could improve the output from DeForest's Audion, one of the many things that landed them in court, but he also became convinced that there was a solution to this.
From the singing clock.
AM radio's scratchy, static-ridden sound. And hundreds of hours and hundreds of test tubes later, he had invented FM.
David, this is going to mean a whole new broadcasting game. Sit down, light a cigar, listen.
Armstrong, played by David Ogden Stiers, is sharing the future of radio. David Sarnoff's relationship with Armstrong eventually disintegrated, but he was among the first to see the potential for radio programming in his inventions. In this aim, Sarnoff was aided by the changing landscape of both technology and policy. During the First World War, radio was an important communications tool, but it also posed a potential threat. Anyone, including the enemy, could access an open communications line. So after the war, the government, as so often in this country, shaped a policy that fell somewhere between freedom and restraint. In 1927, it created the Federal Radio Commission, charged with licensing and monitoring radio stations. It also allocated bandwidth, which was needed in the days when audio was a direct signal transmitted to a localized receiver.
Don't touch that dial.
And in 1934, Congress passed a Communications Act that was the first major piece of legislation aimed at defining and controlling telephone, telegraph, and radio communications. It created the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC still dominates our lives today and presides over every aspect of media, including the vigilant prosecution of the use of the 7 forbidden words on the air. You know what they are. The FCC, among other things, defined what actually constituted a radio station. The licensing criteria, up-to-date technology, Licensed operators, the number of hours the station offered programming each day, and how far your signal reached, favored commercial ad-supported stations. Community and educational stations often had limited resources. Between the late 1920s and the early 1940s, consolidation, cross-fertilization, and government intervention created ABC, CBS, and NBC, derived from Sarnoff's RCA. By 1940, these broadcast powerhouses, the same ones that dominate broadcast television today, were providing programming variously to over 700 radio stations. This newly emerging marketplace required, above all, content. Sarnoff's RCA manufactured radios, and he and everyone else were trying to determine what would happen when you turned one on.
And by the turn of the 30s, radio was really solidifying its place in American life. The sale of huge console radios went soaring.
That's historian Leonard Maltin again.
So to fill all the hours that were available to various stations and sponsors, entertainment had to be generated in the smallest communities and in the largest cities.
In the early days of broadcast, a person could get on the air with pretty much any act that involved sound, and almost any entity that could transmit could be a station. Here's Himan Brown remembering the early days.
So all these small stations that were getting licensed all over the place were using people to read poetry. Actors, of course, but nobody really got more than $2 or $3 or $4. And that's where I went. I went to the local radio stations. The first station I touched was WRNY. Most of the hotels were getting licenses for radio stations. WRNY was the Roosevelt Hotel. WPCH was the Park Central Hotel. WMCA was the McAlpin Hotel. WGBS was Gimbel Brothers, if you please. And they had a hotel room. They would take the bathroom, knock out the fixtures, and make that into a control room.
But radio quickly outgrew its DIY mode. Several developments accelerated a change from novelty to entertainment medium. In 1923, 1% of U.S. households owned at least one radio receiver. By 1937, 75% of households owned a radio. Listeners became more demanding, more content-hungry, and more loyal. There came to be the idea of a real relationship between programmer and listeners. Here's a comic scene from Empire of the Air.
I'd like to congratulate you on a nearly perfect audition.
Well, thank you, sir. As I mentioned to you, I've had a little vocal training.
Yes, I can tell that. No fear of the microphone, have you?
Well, sir, it's a little bit anonymous.
Mr. Husing, I want you to take a look at that large photograph on the studio wall there.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering about that.
That's Mrs. F.J. Edgars, a working man's wife, living in this city, Mr. Husing, with her 3 adorable babies. Look at her picture. Print it in your mind's eye, sir. Remember, while you are on the air, you are a guest in her home.
You'll have noticed that the woman in this scene is a housewife. I said earlier that the world of radio inventors was a bit of a boys' club. Few women had access to the right environments or tools. But commercial entertainment radio became one of the places in which women, from actors like my mother to writers and technicians, began to really make their mark. And housewives were a power to be reckoned with because they did the shopping.
And there go the big guns, reminding us all that puffed wheat and puffed rice actually are shot from guns right in the Quaker plant. Nourishing grains of sun-ripened wheat and rice are loaded into the guns, and then they're exploded to 8 times their normal size. That's what makes puffed wheat and puffed rice so specially easy to digest, so that you get their trigger-fast food energy much more quickly and easily. And that's important if you want to think fast and act fast like Dick Tracy does. Look to see at the end of today's program, and if there isn't one of those famous red and blue packages in the pantry now, ask Mother to order some from the grocer's. Be sure to be glad when you remind her of something so specially good for breakfast.
networks became efficient content-producing machines driven by commercial sponsorship that had a different way of thinking about the audience as potential consumers. And Himan Brown excelled at creating material that engaged them. We'll hear more about that in a later episode. Tom Lewis, the author of Empire of the Air, wrote an article in 1992 in which he described radio as a godlike presence, one that was pervasive and powerful. But like mythological gods who disguise themselves as mortals, it still had to behave as a guest in your home. Whether as guest or god, Himan Brown wanted radio in his life.
And entertainment was beginning to come through this magic of the air. And it seemed to say to me, this is where I belong. This is what I should be doing. My gosh, I could reach hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And it was such a simple thing to do, along with everything else.
This is the world that Brown entered, and we'll be exploring it more fully in our third episode. But first, in order to understand who Himan Brown became, we need to understand where and what he came from. This is Audio Maverick. Next time, new world, new beginnings. I'm Margot Avery. Stay tuned. Audio Maverick is produced and directed by Sarah Montague, who also writes the scripts. Our executive producers are Melina Brown and Sarah Montague. CUNY TV's executive director is Chiqui Cartagena. The director of production is Susan Iger, and Deborah Labadie is CUNY TV's chief operating officer. The associate producer for Audio Maverick is Corinne Wallace, and our audio production intern is Lucia Funaro. Audio Maverick is narrated by Margot Avery. Additional readers include Chris Berube and Andrew Jaffe. Our technical team at CUNY includes senior audio engineer Richard Kim and audio engineer and program mix engineer Lisa Goslin. Our staff photographer is Laura Fuchs. Our archivists are David Rice and Katrina Schlosser. The script editor is Allison Berenger. Our theme music is composed by Allison Leighton Brown. Sound design and final mixing are by John Delore and Bart Warshaw. Multitude Productions handles our publicity and marketing. Excerpts from the Himan Brown Oral History, courtesy of the Directors Guild of America, Inc. www.dga.org. All rights reserved. The material from the broadcast version of Empire of the Air is used courtesy of Otherworld Media. Audio Maverick is a production of CUNY TV.